The smell hit her first. Smoke and scorched straw and something underneath it that she could not name, but would never forget the particular stench of a winter's survival burning down to nothing in the dark. Olive Lawson stood at the edge of her property in the blue-black hour before dawn, her bare feet pressing into the frozen earth of the Montana Territory, and she watched what remained of her haystack collapse inward on itself like a dying star. Sparks shot upward and dissolved into the October sky. The frost that had been threatening for 3 days was already crystallizing on the dead grass around her boots, and she understood, with the cold, precise clarity of a woman who had spent 4 years learning to survive alone, exactly what this meant. She would lose the cattle before Christmas. Without that hay, she had nothing to feed 32 head of Hereford cattle through a Montana winter. Without those cattle, she had no income come spring. Without income, she could not make the land payment she owed to the Territorial Bank in Helena. And without that land, she had nothing. Literally nothing. The homestead, the well she had dug herself with blistered palms, the garden she had planted from seeds her mother had pressed into her hands at a train station in Ohio 4 years ago, all of it would vanish. Olive did not cry. She was past the kind of grief that produced tears. Instead, she stood very still in the burning orange glow, and she let the truth settle into her bones alongside the frost, and then she thought one word, quiet and volcanic all at once. Dalton. Silas Dalton. Her neighbor to the east, her closest rival for the water rights to Crooked Creek, the man who had been systematically trying to break her since the week she had arrived in Harlan County, and refused to sell him the 40 acres that bordered his pasture. She had no proof yet, not the kind that would stand up in front of Sheriff Pruitt, who was Dalton's cousin by marriage and had never once looked directly at Olive when she spoke to him. But she knew. The way you know when a storm is coming even before the clouds appear. You feel it in your chest. You feel it as a kind of betrayal so large it has its own weather system. She turned and walked back toward the house, and it was in that moment, boots crunching on frost-stiffened grass, smoke still rising behind her into the dark Montana sky, that she heard the hoofbeats on the road. She stopped. A single rider, moving slow. Not the panicked gallop of someone drawn by the fire, but the measured, deliberate pace of a man who was either very calm or very lost. The horse came into view at the edge of her property where the road curved past her fence line, and the rider pulled up short when he saw the smoldering ruin of the haystack. He sat there for a moment, silhouetted against the sky, his hat brim cutting a hard line against the orange glow. "That your stack?" He called down. She stood her ground. In the Montana Territory in the year 1882, a woman standing alone at her property line at 4 in the morning with a still burning fire behind her and a stranger on horseback in front of her was in a situation that required considerable judgment. She had a rifle inside the door. She had a pistol on the table beside her bed where she had left it when she ran outside. She had her voice. "It was," she said. The man dismounted. Not quickly. Not with the slick confidence of someone trying to impress her, but with the unhurried movement of a man who was accustomed to long days and tired horses and situations that required patience. He dropped his reins over the fence post without tying them, which told her something about the animal. It would not run. He walked toward her with his hands visible at his sides, and when the firelight reached his face she saw him clearly for the first time. He was perhaps 30 years old. Dark hair beneath a dust-colored hat, jaw shadowed with several days of travel. His coat was a working man's coat, canvas, heavy, practical, and his boots were the kind that had seen genuine miles. He had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved by weather and kept by something quieter. Brown eyes, serious, a mouth that seemed like it knew how to stay closed. "Frost tonight," he said, looking past her at the smoldering ruins. "Maybe tomorrow, too." "I know," she said. "You have cattle, 32 head." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the haystack. He looked at the frozen ground. He looked at her, and she did not look away. "That was set," he said. It was not a question. Olive felt something shift beneath her sternum. Not because she was surprised by the observation, but because he had said it simply, without flinching, without the particular brand of performative skepticism that men in this territory applied to everything a woman claimed. He had looked at the perimeter of the fire, at the way it had started from the outside in rather than from any internal collapse or spontaneous heat, and he had drawn the same conclusion she had, and he had said it plainly. Yes, she said, it was set. He looked at her again, and something in his expression settled, the way a stone settles when it finds the bottom of still water. My name is Marshall Vaughn, he said. I was heading for the town of Harlan. I have a room reserved at the boarding house. He paused. I am in no particular hurry to get there. Olive Lawson had been on her own for 4 years. Before that, she had been a farmer's daughter in Ohio, then a farmer's wife briefly and disastrously in a marriage that ended when her husband decided Kansas suited him better than she did and walked away from both. She had come to Montana with a land grant, a trunk, a box of seeds, and the privately held conviction that she was better at being alone than she was at trusting people. 4 years of brutal winters and crop failures and water rights disputes, and a neighbor who played long games of quiet sabotage, had done nothing to soften that conviction. She looked at this man, Marshall Vaughn, on his way to Harlan, in no particular hurry, and she made a calculation. There is a lantern in my barn, she said, and tools. I need to know the extent of what is left. He nodded once and fell into step beside her, and that was how it began. To understand how Olive Lawson arrived at that frozen, smoke-scented morning with her haystack burning, and a stranger at her fence line, you had to go back to the spring of 1878, to a train platform in Columbus, Ohio, where a 23-year-old woman with a land grant certificate folded inside her corset, and a heart full of something she was not yet willing to name, as Hope had stepped onto a westbound train and chosen a life that did not ask her permission before demanding everything she had. She had filed for a homestead under the Homestead Act of 1862, 160 acres of Montana Territory land that she would own free and clear after 5 years of continuous improvement and residence. The clerk in Columbus had looked at her as though she had announced she intended to swim to the moon. A woman, alone, filing a homestead claim, in Montana. She had smiled politely and thanked him for the paperwork. The land itself was extraordinary. She had understood that the moment she saw it, a broad, south-facing slope in the Judith Basin country, sheltered on the north by a ridge of ponderosa pine, crossed by a tributary of Crooked Creek that ran clear and cold, and would keep running through all but the hardest winters. The soil was deep and dark and willing. She had stood on it that first morning, still dizzy from the journey, and she had felt for the first time in her adult life that she was standing on something that would not move beneath her. The problem arrived almost immediately in the form of Silas Dalton. Dalton was 42 years old, a cattle baron by Montana standards, which meant he ran 1,000 head on land he had acquired through a combination of purchase, intimidation, and the particular legal creativity available to men with money and friends in the territorial government. He was not unattractive, in the way that hard men with authority sometimes are broad-shouldered, silver-haired at the temples, with a rancher's ease and a politician's smile. He had come to Olive's door 3 days after she arrived, hat in hand, and made his first offer for her 40 eastern acres. She had declined. He had come back with a larger offer. She had declined again. He had sent his foreman. He had sent his lawyer from Helena. He had sent his lawyer from Helena a second time with papers that suggested there might be a technical question about the southern boundary of her land grant. She had hired her own lawyer, a young man named Travers in the town of Harlan, who was honest if overwhelmed, and the boundary question had been resolved in her favor. After that, Dalton stopped sending lawyers and started sending problems. A fence section cut in the night, letting his cattle onto her pasture. A diversion of the creek upstream that left her south irrigation channel dry for 2 weeks during planting season. A rumor spread through Harlan that she was keeping a disreputable establishment, which was nonsense that took 2 seasons to fully die. Small cruelties, each one deniable, each one calibrated to wear her down without giving her anything solid to bring to the law. She had not broken. She had repaired the fences, rerouted the irrigation, held her head up in town, and planted more ground each spring. She had bought her cattle from a rancher in Lewistown who respected competence over gender. She had learned everything: how to winter livestock, how to manage a root cellar, how to doctor a sick calf at 3 in the morning with no one to help her. She had built herself into something formidable and solitary and deeply, privately exhausted. And then, in the October of 1882, with the first heavy frost expected any day, someone had burned her haystack to the ground. She knew it was Dalton. She knew it the way she knew the sound of her own heartbeat. But knowing and proving were different countries, and she was standing in the dark between them with 32 cattle and no winter feed. Marshal Vaughn held the lantern while she walked the burned perimeter, crouching here and there to look at the ground. He did not ask questions. He did not offer reassurances. He watched, and he was quiet, and that silence was one of the more useful things anyone had offered her in recent memory. "Started in 3 places," she said, pointing. "Here, here, and on the far side. You cannot get 3 independent starting points from accident." "No," he said, "you cannot." She stood up and looked at him directly. "Who are you?" she said. "Actually." He met her gaze without flinching. "Marshal Vaughn, lately of the Bitterroot Valley, before that Wyoming. I worked cattle for 8 years, and before that I did 3 years as a deputy marshal in Laramie County." He paused. "Before that, things that are less interesting to speak of at 4 in the morning. Deputy marshal." That explained the calm, she thought. That explained the way he had read the fire. "Why are you in Harlan?" she asked. "I have a letter of inquiry from a rancher named Elkins who is looking for an experienced hand with some management capacity. I do not know yet if the job suits me or if I suit the job. I was going to spend a week finding out." He looked around at the burned ground. "I had not expected to find this on the road." There was something in the way he said it, not theatrical, not performative, but genuine. As though finding someone in catastrophe on a dark road was something that actually troubled him. "There is nothing you can do tonight," she said. "The damage is done." "The frost will be down hard before morning," he said. "You have any cattle in the open field?" She had not thought of that. She had been so consumed by the haystack, by the enormity of the feed problem, that she had not thought of the immediate danger of the frost to the young calves she had in the south pasture. She was already moving. He brought the calves in. She had not asked him to. She had grabbed a rope and a lantern and set off at a fast walk toward the south pasture gate, and he had simply fallen into step on her left and moved as someone who knew how to work without being directed. There were 6 calves in the south pasture, late-season animals that had not yet developed the fat reserves to tolerate a hard frost, and they brought them in together in the dark, moving quietly and efficiently, without wasted motion. By the time the last calf was secured in the barn with clean straw beneath it and the gate bolted, the sky in the east had gone from black to the deep blue that precedes a Montana dawn. The temperature had dropped another 4 or 5 degrees while they worked. Their breath made clouds in the lantern light. Olive stood at the barn door and felt the full weight of the night settle over her. The haystack was gone. The frost was real. She had 32 head of cattle and enough feed in the barn to last perhaps 6 weeks, when she would need at least 18 or 20. She thought, with a coldness that was separate from the weather, about Silas Dalton sleeping comfortably 4 miles to the east in a house with wood floors and glass windows and a cook who made biscuits at dawn. "You should go," she said to Marshal Vaughn. "You have a room at the boarding house and a meeting with Elkins." He was leaning against the fence post with his arms folded, looking out at the dark ridge to the north. He had taken his hat off and held it in one hand, and without it he looked younger somehow, though not less serious. "Elkins can wait until morning," he said. "It is morning," she said. He looked at the sky. The blue was deepening toward lavender. "Nearly," he said. "Miss," he stopped. "I do not know your name." "Lawson," she said. "Olive Lawson." He nodded as though this confirmed something. "Miss Lawson, I have been riding since noon yesterday and I am not at my best, but I can see clear enough to know that you have a serious problem and that you are going to need help before this day is done. I am not in the habit of riding away from something like this." She studied him. She had been burned metaphorically and now literally by trust extended carelessly. She had learned to read people with a skeptic's eye, looking for the hidden motive, the angle, the thing they wanted from her that they were not stating plainly. She looked at Marshall Vaughn in the lavender dawn and tried to find the trap. She did not find one, which did not mean it was not there. "I cannot pay you," she said. "I have very little cash money and what I have is committed to the bank payment in November." "I did not ask to be paid," he said. "Then what do you want?" He was quiet for a moment, then, "To not have ridden past," he said simply. She did not know what to do with that, so she said, "There is coffee on the stove." He fed and watered his horse first. She noticed that. She noticed the way he moved around the animal, not roughly, not with the impatience of a man who viewed a horse as a tool, but with the familiarity of a long partnership, checking the animal's feet, speaking to it quietly while he worked. It told her something. The coffee was hot and dark, and she had cornbread left from the previous night's supper. She set it on the table without ceremony and sat across from him, and they drank in silence for a while, which was the most comfortable silence she had experienced in longer than she cared to recall. "Where can you get hay?" he said, eventually. "The nearest reliable supply is the Kowalski farm 9 miles northwest," she said. "Heinrich Kowalski cut a significant crop this summer and I know he has surplus, but I cannot afford to buy what I need at market price, and the Harlan feed store will be sold out within a week once word gets out about the frost. Everyone in the county is going to be scrambling. Is there anyone else with surplus stock?" "There is a farmer named Briggs on the South Road who had a good hay year, but he is a Dalton man, and he will not sell to me." Marshall's expression shifted slightly. "This Dalton, what is his full name?" "Silas Dalton. He runs the Crooked Creek Ranch, roughly 12,000 acres. He has been trying to acquire my Eastern 40 for 4 years." "And you believe he burned your stack?" "I know he burned my stack. I cannot prove it." Marshall turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. She watched his face move through something, a calculation or a memory or both. "Dalton," he said. "I have heard that name. He is a significant man in the territory. His name is heard often." "Not in the way I heard it," Marshall said and left it there. She did not press him, not yet. There were more immediate things to solve. "Today," she said, "I need to get to Kowalski's farm and make whatever deal I can. I need to find a way to move hay 9 miles with 1 wagon and 2 horses. And I need to do it before the second frost hits, which I expect is 3 or 4 days away." "That is a great deal for one person to do in 3 or 4 days," he said. "Yes," she agreed. He finished his coffee and set the cup down with a quiet click on the pine table. "Then it is fortunate that there are 2 of us," he said. She opened her mouth to tell him that she did not need his charity, that she had been managing alone for 4 years, that she did not know him, and had no particular reason to trust a man she had found on a dark road at 4 in the morning. All of this was true, and she had rehearsed versions of it many times in many different contexts. She was very good at self-sufficiency and moderately good at refusing help, but the frost was real. The haystack was ash. 32 cattle were depending on her, and the particular pride that would make her send him away was not, in this specific moment, a luxury she could afford. "All right," she said. He nodded as though this were settled. Heinrich Kowalski was a broad-shouldered German immigrant who had been farming the Judith Basin for 12 years, and who measured the world in yields per acre and the quality of a handshake. He had 3 daughters, a well-trained team of Percherons, and a surplus hay barn that still held perhaps 40 tons of mixed grass and clover hay from a generous summer. Olive and Marshall arrived at the Kowalski farm by 8 in the morning, having stopped at the burned haystack long enough to assess the full extent of the damage in daylight, which was considerable and unambiguous. Marshall had photographed the 3 starting points of the fire in his mind, with the methodical attention of a man who had once made his living gathering evidence, and had said nothing while he did it. Heinrich Kowalski came out of his house when he heard the wagon and stood on his porch looking at them with the measuring expression of a man who was already aware that Olive Lawson had lost her hay. News in a rural county moves on its own schedule, and the smoke from the Lawson property had been visible from the Kowalski farm before dawn. "Olive," he said, coming down off the porch. He looked at Marshall. "I do not know you." "Marshall Vaughn," Marshall said, and shook the man's hand in the direct, unaffected way that told Kowalski immediately that this was not a man wasting his time. "I know what you are here for," Kowalski said to Olive. His expression was not unkind, but it was cautious. "Word is you lost your whole stack." "I did," she said. He looked at the sky, at the frost that was still visible in the shadows where the morning sun had not yet reached. "I have been approached already," he said carefully, "by someone from the Crooked Creek Ranch." Olive went very still. "Dalton," Marshall said. Kowalski looked at him. "His foreman, an hour ago, before sunrise, offered me full market price for 40 tons, immediate payment in cash." Olive understood immediately. It was elegant in the way that truly malicious plans sometimes are. Burn her feed, then buy up the closest available surplus before she could get to it, leaving her no options and no time. She felt the rage move through her like a current, clean and cold and clarifying. "Heinrich," she said, and her voice was very even. "We have been neighbors for 4 years. I helped your daughter when her colt was foaling in that January storm. I shared my garden seed with your wife in the dry year. I have never asked you for anything." Kowalski looked at her. He was a man with a complicated conscience, which was better than a man with a simple one. "Dalton's man said I had until noon to decide," he said. "What time is it now?" Marshall asked. Kowalski pulled out his watch. "8:30. "Then we have time to discuss," Marshall said. "Let us walk." He moved toward the hay barn with the quiet assumption that Kowalski would follow, and Kowalski followed, because there was something about Marshall Vaughn's certainty that made it very difficult to do anything else. Olive heard them talking inside the barn, not the words, but the tone. Marshall's voice low and steady, Kowalski's responding with increasing engagement. She stood in the morning sun and breathed and thought about Silas Dalton and the particular dark satisfaction he must be feeling right now, 4 miles east, waiting for her to fail. She was not going to fail. When Marshall came out of the barn, he was followed by Kowalski, who had the expression of a man who had made a decision and was at peace with it. "I will sell you 20 tons, Kowalski said to Olive. "Not 40, I must keep something in reserve for my own herd. But 20 tons at cost, not market price, because you have been a good neighbor and because I am not a man who assists his neighbor's enemy without knowing it." He looked at her steadily. "But there is a condition." "Name it," she said. "I need help getting my north field harvested before the second frost. The ground crew I hired from town is 3 men short, and I have 6 days of grain left standing." He looked between her and Marshall. "You help me with my harvest, I will help you with your hay. Wagons going both ways." She looked at Marshall. He looked at her. There was a brief, wordless exchange between them, the kind that usually takes months of acquaintance to develop, and they both turned back to Kowalski. "Agreed," Olive said. "Agreed," Marshall said. They started that morning. Marshall worked the north field alongside Kowalski's 2 farmhands, and Olive managed the wagon loads and the documentation, keeping track of what was cut and what remained. And by noon, they had the first 3 loads of hay stacked on her wagon and on the loan of Kowalski's second wagon. The work was hard and immediate and left no room for the particular kind of brooding that Olive had been doing since 4 in the morning. Dalton's foreman, a lean, watchful man named Cutter who had cold eyes and the unhurried manner of someone very comfortable with intimidation, appeared at the Kowalski farm gate at precisely noon. He looked at Olive's wagon, loaded with hay. He looked at Marshall, who was standing with Kowalski, and he recalculated something behind his cold eyes. "Kowalski," he called out, not bothering to dismount, "Mr. Dalton is waiting on your answer." He can wait longer, Kowalski said pleasantly. I have made other arrangements. Cutter's gaze moved to Olive, then to Marshall. He studied Marshall for a moment with the particular attention of a man cataloging a potential problem. Marshall looked back at him with no particular expression at all, which was, Olive thought, somehow more unsettling than any display of hostility would have been. Dalton will want to know who the extra hand is, Cutter said. Marshall Vaughn, Marshall said evenly, formerly of Laramie County. I expect Mr. Dalton can find that information useful or leave it, as he chooses. Cutter looked at him for one long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward Crooked Creek Ranch without another word. He will report back immediately, Olive said. Yes, Marshall agreed. Dalton will not like what he hears. No, Marshall agreed again. He will not. There was a beat of silence. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of Marshall's mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement of the situation's complicated humor. She felt it catch in her chest in a way that surprised her, and she looked away and went back to checking the wagon load. They worked through the afternoon, in a rhythm that surprised her. She had worked alongside hired hands before, and the experience was usually one of management. She gave direction, they executed, and there was always a layer of friction because she was a woman directing men who were quietly, persistently uncertain about the propriety of that arrangement. Marshall Vaughn operated on a different principle entirely. He watched what needed doing and he did it. He adapted. When she said, without preamble, that she needed the north load stacked crosswise for stability on the road, he stacked it crosswise without discussion. When she spotted a weakening wheel spoke on Kowalski's wagon and pointed it out, he found the spare spoke in the barn and replaced it before they set out. He was efficient in the way that people are efficient when they are genuinely present in a task, rather than performing competence for an audience. They made 2 full trips to her farm before the sun dropped behind the ridge, and by the time they unloaded the second wagon in the last of the October light, she had perhaps 8 tons of hay stacked where the old haystack had stood. It was not enough, but it was a beginning. Marshall unsaddled his horse in her barn and rubbed the animal down, and gave it a portion of oats from the bin in the corner, and she noticed he asked before using the oats, which was such a small thing and so unexpectedly thoughtful that she had to look at the wall for a moment. She made a proper supper. Stewed beef with potatoes and dried beans, the kind of meal that was adequate to serious hunger, and she set it on the table without apology for its plainness. He ate it without ceremony and thanked her without flattery, and she thought again that she could not find the trap. "You were a deputy marshal for 3 years," she said, when the supper plates were cleared and the coffee was on. "Yes, in Laramie County, that is Wyoming territory. Yes. Why did you leave?" He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup. It was his thinking gesture. She was beginning to understand not evasion but genuine consideration. "A case went wrong," he said. "I believed a man was guilty of something and I pursued the evidence accordingly, and I was right about the guilt but wrong about the method. And a woman and her son had to leave their home because of what I did, even though I was trying to protect them. The law was satisfied with my conduct. I was not." He paused. "I left because I could not see a way to keep doing the work the way it had to be done, and also be the kind of man I wanted to be." She absorbed this. "What was the case?" He looked at her steadily. "A cattle baron named French was running a protection scheme across 3 counties. I had enough evidence to get him for rustling but not for the protection payments, so I used the rustling charge to put pressure on the families he was protecting, and 2 of them testified against him, and one of those families was targeted by French's men afterward. The mother and son had to relocate. French went to prison for 12 years. The family relocated safely in the end, and they are, as far as I know, doing well in Colorado. But I had made a choice that was not mine to make for them. And the way I justified it at the time, the greater good, the necessity of it, I do not trust that justification in my own mouth anymore." She looked at him. "That is a very specific and honest thing to admit to a stranger." "You asked a specific and honest question," he said. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. Outside, the temperature was dropping again. She could feel it in the way the window panes were beginning to gather their thin skin of ice at the corners. "Why do you think Dalton burned my haystack?" he asked. "Beyond the land dispute, there must be something more immediate." She set down her coffee. "The water rights hearing," she said. "November 15th. The territorial court is finally taking up the Crooked Creek water rights dispute. I have been building the case for 2 years, evidence that Dalton illegally diverted the creek in the dry years, documentation of the downstream impact on my land. If I win the hearing, he loses the right to divert, which affects his ability to water his western pasture and would force him to sell approximately 1,000 acres. And if you lose your property before the hearing, then I am no longer a party withstanding. He wins by default." Marshall was quiet. His expression had settled into something careful and controlled. "When did you last speak to your lawyer?" "Travers. I rode into Harlan 3 days ago. He says the case is strong. He is nervous about Dalton's connections to the land office but believes the court record is solid." "Who is the presiding judge?" "Judge Mallory from Great Falls. He is a circuit judge, not a local appointment. Travers says he is honest." "I know of Mallory," Marshall said. "He is honest." She looked at him. "You have a wide knowledge of territory figures for a man who was planning to spend a week deciding whether to take a ranching job." He held her gaze. "I grew up in Montana," he said. "Billings originally. I know the territory." He paused. "And I will tell you something I was going to hold until I knew you better, but I think the situation requires it. The reason Dalton's name was familiar to me when you mentioned it. I have met Silas Dalton before, in Laramie, in 1879. He came through on a cattle deal, and I had reason to look into some of his business practices in connection with a separate matter. What I found I could not act on at the time because it was outside my jurisdiction, but I kept notes." She went very still. "What kind of notes?" "The kind that would be relevant to a territorial water rights hearing," he said, "and possibly to a criminal inquiry." The stove ticked. The window panes gathered ice. "Marshall," she said, and she used his name for the first time without thinking about it, "why are you in Harlan County?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I told you, a letter of inquiry from a man named Elkins. But that is not all of it." He was quiet. "Then, I heard about the water rights case through a contact at the land office in Helena. The details: 1 woman against Dalton, evidence of illegal diversion, a hearing in November. I was curious. I had information that might help but no way to introduce it." He stopped. "This is not a trap, Miss Lawson. I am not Dalton's man. I have no hidden motive beyond the one I have stated. But I understand why you might not believe that." She thought about it. She thought about the way he had handled the calves in the dark without being asked, the way he had talked to Kowalski, the way he had looked at the fire's starting points and called it exactly what it was. "I believe you," she said. "I should probably be more suspicious than I am, but I have run out of the kind of energy that makes excessive suspicion possible." Something crossed his face then, not quite amusement and not quite relief, but something between them that was warmer than either. "I will go to the boarding house tonight," he said. "I should tell Elkins something, and I need my saddlebag which has the notes in it." He stood up. "Tomorrow morning I will be here early. We have 5 more days of harvest to do at Kowalski's before the deal is complete, and I need to look at your southern fence line. If someone entered your property from the east to set that fire, there will be a trail I can follow." "The ground was already freezing last night," she said. "The trail may be gone." "Maybe," he said. "Maybe not all of it." He left, and she listened to the hoofbeats fade down the road toward Harlan, and she sat at her kitchen table in the quiet house and felt something she could not immediately name. The house had been quiet for years, and she had made her peace with the quiet. This was a different quality of quiet, the kind that comes after something has been present and then withdrawn, like the warm space left in a chair. She did not examine it too closely. She had practical things to think about. He was back at her property before 7 the next morning, which meant he had risen before 6 and ridden 9 miles in the dark. She had coffee hot and had been up since 5 and was mending fence gear in the barn when she heard his horse on the road. "Elkins," she said when he came through the barn door. "A decent man," Marshall said. "The job is genuine." I told him I had prior commitments for the next 2 weeks and he said he would hold the position. He set down his saddlebag on the workbench. "I have the notes here. We should look at them before we go to Kowalski's." They spread the papers on the kitchen table. Marshall's notes were meticulous, the way a former lawman's notes are meticulous, with dates and names and specific amounts. In the spring of 1879, Silas Dalton had been in Laramie in connection with a land deal that had, at the time, looked like simple, aggressive acquisition. But what Marshall had uncovered and documented was a pattern of fraudulent land surveys that had been falsified to misrepresent the location of water sources and property boundaries, giving Dalton's purchases the appearance of less value than they actually held, and allowing him to acquire at below-market rates from sellers who did not know what they were selling. "This is the same pattern he used against me," Olive said, leaning over the papers. "The boundary question in my first year here. He hired a surveyor who produced a report that suggested my eastern line was 40 feet inside where it actually is. My lawyer caught it in the records. The surveyor he used in Laramie was a man named Peabody. Is the surveyor who produced the false report on your property also named Peabody?" She was very still. She went to her own file box on the shelf by the window and pulled out a sheaf of papers and leafed through them with hands that were steadier than she felt. She found the document. "R.J. Peabody," she said. "Surveyor. Licensed. Territorial credential number 447. They looked at each other across the table. "That is evidence of a pattern," Marshall said. "Pattern evidence is not proof of the haystack, but it speaks to character and method, and in a water rights hearing before an honest judge it may be very useful. It also gives your lawyer something to work with regarding the survey dispute, which could reopen questions about the original property filing. This could be larger than the water rights case," she said. "Yes," he said. "It could." She looked at the papers. She thought about Silas Dalton's smile, which she had seen precisely once, on the day he had come to her door with his first offer and she had declined, and the smile had stayed exactly in place like a painting of itself. "I need to get this to Trevor's," she said. "After Kowalski's harvest today," Marshall said. "You need the hay. The legal case can be a day behind." He paused. "But tonight if you can ride to Harlan." "I can ride to Harlan tonight," she said. They went to Kowalski's and worked through the morning and into the afternoon, with the focused intensity of people who understood the deadline they were working against. The north field was 3/4 cut now, and Kowalski had brought in 2 additional hands, local boys who had heard about Olive's situation and come to help with the easy straightforwardness of rural community that had been one of the genuine surprises of Olive's Western life. She had come expecting isolation and had found something more complicated and more human, a community that was small and imperfect and capable of remarkable solidarity when it chose to be. Marshall found time during the midday break to walk the fence line on the eastern edge of Olive's property. She went with him because it was her land and her right to know what was there. The frost had been hard but not total. In the sheltered places along the fence where the soil was thicker, there were traces. A post that had been leaned against and left a small depression in the soil. A section of fence where 2 strands of wire had been spread apart and not fully recovered. Someone had passed through, going west toward the haystack and then returning east, and caught on a barb of wire at exactly the height of a man's lower coat, a small square of dark canvas, perhaps 2 inches across, with a distinctive orange thread along one edge. Marshall held it carefully. He did not say anything immediately. "Do you know anyone who works for Dalton who wears a canvas coat with orange thread trim?" Olive asked. "Not yet," he said, "but I will." He kept the fabric square in his breast pocket and they went back to the harvest. That evening, Olive rode to Harlan with Marshall alongside her. The town was a substantial one for the Montana Territory of 1882, a main street of perhaps 300 yards with a general store, a hardware merchant, a small hotel, the boarding house where Marshall was staying, 2 saloons, a church, a livery stable, a telegraph office, and the shared offices of 3 lawyers, of which young Travers occupied the smallest. Travers was in his office when they arrived, working by lamplight on what appeared to be a considerable amount of paperwork. He was perhaps 28, slight and earnest, with the perpetual slight anxiety of a man who was aware that the forces arrayed against his clients were significantly better funded than he was. He stood up when Olive came in and looked at Marshall with a question in his expression. "This is Marshall Vaughn," Olive said. "He has been helping me. He has information relevant to the case." She laid Marshall's notes on the desk, and then her own file with the Peabody survey, and then she talked for 20 minutes and Marshall talked for 10, and Travers listened to all of it with increasing attention and decreasing anxiety, the way a man looks when pieces he has been searching for begin to arrive in unexpected combinations. "The Peabody connection is significant," Travers said when they had finished. "We can get the territorial licensing records and establish that the same man produced falsified surveys in multiple cases. That is a pattern of fraud that goes beyond the local dispute." He looked at the canvas square which Marshall had placed on the desk with the orange thread visible. "And this, we need to establish whose it is." "I will attend to that," Marshall said. Travers looked at him steadily. "How?" "Carefully and within the law," Marshall said. "I am not a deputy marshal anymore. I understand what I can and cannot do." Travers seemed to accept this. They organized the papers and Travers promised to file an amended complaint before the court by the end of the week, adding the survey fraud as a secondary element of the hearing. As they walked out of the law office into the night air of Harlan's Main Street, Olive felt something shift in the architecture of the situation, the way a building settles when a new beam takes the weight correctly. She still had a very large problem, but the problem had a shape now, and shapes were things she could work with. "I owe you a great deal," she said. "You owe me nothing," Marshall said. "That is not true. You have given me 2 days of hard labor and a set of notes that may save my property." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. The main street of Harlan was quiet in the evening, a few lights burning in windows, someone playing a fiddle somewhere distant and slightly out of tune. "Miss Lawson," he said, and his voice was different, lower, more careful. "I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly so there is no misunderstanding." She waited. "I came to Harlan with a vague intention that had nothing to do with you. I found you in a genuine crisis and I helped because it needed doing. I expect nothing from you in return and I am not building toward anything." He paused. "But I want to stay. Not because of the case and not because of the cattle and not because I feel obligated. I want to stay because I have spent 3 days in your company and I find you to be the most substantial thing I have encountered in a considerable time." He stopped. That may be an uncomfortable thing to hear. It was. It was also the most honest thing anyone had said to her since she could remember. "I do not do well with comfortable things," she said after a moment. "They make me suspicious." He almost smiled. "That is a reasonable response to your history," he said. "Marshall," she said, using his name deliberately this time. "I think you should know that I am not a woman who makes things simple. I have a land dispute, a water rights hearing, a neighbor who sets fires, 32 cattle, and 4 years of practice at being alone. I do not know what I am doing with any of it except the cattle." "You are doing remarkably well with all of it," he said. "I am surviving it," she said. "That is different from doing well." "I know the difference," he said. "I have been surviving for 3 years." He looked at her with those serious brown eyes in the lamplight of the main street, and there was nothing performed in it, nothing strategic. "I think perhaps we could do something better than survive, if you were willing." She looked at him for a long moment. The fiddle played somewhere in the dark, off-key and earnest. The frost was coming down again on the rooftops. "You should know," she said finally, that I do not trust easily and I do not forgive betrayal and I have very strong opinions about fence maintenance. I gathered all three of those things within the first hour, he said. She looked at the street. She looked at him. She thought about the dark road at 4 in the morning and the calves brought in from the frost and the notes in meticulous handwriting and the way he had asked before using her oats. "Come back tomorrow morning," she said. "We have more hay to move." He nodded. 7 o'clock, he said. 6, she said. 6, he agreed, and something in his expression caught the lamplight in a way that made her walk toward her horse a little faster than was strictly necessary. The next 4 days had the quality of something being built, not constructed from a plan, but grown, the way things grow when conditions are right and you stop preventing them. They worked the Kowalski harvest and moved hay, and Olive managed her cattle, and Marshall spent his evenings making quiet inquiries in Harlan about the canvas square and the orange thread. On the third day, he found what he was looking for. There was a man in Harlan named Greer who worked occasionally for the Crooked Creek Ranch as a day laborer, and who had, that October, purchased a canvas jacket from the general store with a distinctive orange trim around the collar and cuffs. The store owner remembered it specifically because the trim was an unusual choice for a working coat, and the man had seemed to find it amusing. Greer had also been seen at the Crooked Creek Ranch the afternoon before Olive's haystack burned, which Kowalski's eldest daughter confirmed because she had seen him riding the East Road and recognized him by the orange-trimmed coat. It was not ironclad evidence, but it was a chain. A chain that led from Dalton's ranch to a specific man to a specific piece of fabric on Olive's fence. Travers, informed immediately, went to the sheriff. Sheriff Prout received this information with the particular expression of a man facing a conflict between his professional obligations and his personal loyalties, which in this case were directly opposed. He sat behind his desk in the Harlan County Jail and looked at the fabric square and the testimony transcript Travers had taken from the general store owner and the affidavit from Kowalski's daughter, and he said, "This is circumstantial." "It is," Travers agreed. "I would like you to bring Greer in for questioning." There was a long pause. Marshall spoke. "Sheriff Prout," he said, from his position leaning against the wall of the office, arms folded, voice quiet. "I was a deputy marshal in Laramie County for 3 years. I have written to my former supervisor, Marshal Hands, advising him of the situation here and providing the documentation regarding the Peabody surveys, which constitute a fraud that crosses county and possibly territorial lines." He paused. "The marshal's office will be interested in this case. How this develops locally will affect how they view local law enforcement's handling of it." Prout looked at Marshall with something that was not quite hostility, but was very close to it. Looked at the evidence. He looked at Travers. "I will bring Greer in tomorrow," he said. Greer talked within 2 hours of being brought in. He was not a loyal man. He was a hired man who understood that loyal men went to prison while hiring men stayed comfortable, and the mathematics were not favorable to silence. He confirmed that he had set the fire. He confirmed that he had been directed to do so by Dalton's foreman, Cutter, and had been paid $20 in cash. He signed a statement. Cutter was arrested the following morning. Cutter, facing a serious criminal charge, retained the silence of a more genuinely loyal man for approximately 3 days before his lawyer advised him that his options were limited, and his employer had already begun the process of ensuring that no documentation connected the order to the top of the chain. Dalton, it turned out, had miscalculated something important about Cutter. Cutter had been foreman of the Crooked Creek Ranch for 11 years. He was not a man who went quietly to prison, while his employer looked after his interests in the comfortable way that wealthy men look after things, from a distance, with lawyers, from behind insulating layers of deniability. Cutter gave a full account. He gave dates and instructions and the names of 2 witnesses from within the ranch who had been present when the order was given. He gave the name of Peabody the surveyor and described 3 separate occasions on which Dalton had personally directed the falsification of land documents. He gave the names of 2 other landowners, one in the Judith Basin and one south of Harlan, who had been driven from their properties by similar tactics. It was, Travers said when he delivered the news to Olive on a Wednesday morning, one of the most significant confessions in the history of Harlan County. Silas Dalton was arrested on a November morning that was clear and cold as glass. Olive heard about it from Kowalski, who had heard it from the blacksmith, who had seen the sheriff's deputies ride out toward Crooked Creek Ranch at dawn. She was standing in her yard feeding her cattle using Kowalski's hay now, the full arrangement complete, when Marshall rode up fast from the direction of town and dismounted at the gate with the news. She listened to it without speaking. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The water rights hearing is still in November," she said. "Yes, in 2 weeks. The arrest does not automatically resolve the hearing, but the evidence of fraud in the original documents will be central to it, and Travers believes the outcome is significantly strengthened. Will Dalton be in custody by then? He has been taken to Helena. The territorial court there will hold him pending the fraud charges. He has a lawyer, of course, and a great deal of money. But the evidence is solid, and the pattern is documented across multiple incidents. It will not be quick, but it will be thorough," she exhaled. She turned back to her cattle for a moment, watching them move to the hay with their particular patient bovine gravity, and she thought about 4 years of fighting a man who had more of everything: more money, more land, more political connections, more sheer institutional weight. She thought about the fence that had been cut and the irrigation diverted and the rumor spread and the haystack burned. And she thought about the fact that she was still here and her cattle were fed, and the man who had done all of it was in custody in Helena. She thought, too, about the man standing behind her at her gate. "I need to go to Helena for the hearing," she said. "Yes," he said. "I need someone to manage the farm while I am gone, 4 days, perhaps 5. "Yes," he said again. She turned around. He was watching her with that steady, serious attention of his, and she thought about what he had said on the main street of Harlan, the most substantial thing, and she felt the truth of it moving through her in a way she was no longer trying to prevent. "I keep expecting you to leave," she said. He looked at her. "I know," he said. "You have not." "No." She stepped forward and closed the gate between them and looked at him over the top rail in the cold November sunlight. "Why not?" "Because I do not want to," he said. She considered this for a moment. Then she unlatched the gate and opened it wide, which was both a practical action regarding the gate and something considerably more than that, and he came through it. He did not kiss her then. He was a man who understood the difference between the moment that opens and the moment that closes, and he let the opening stay open for a little longer, which was the right instinct. What he did was stand near her in the November sunlight while the cattle ate Kowalski's hay and the ridge of ponderosa pine made its long shadow across the north end of her property, and he said, "Tell me what you need for the trip to Helena." And she told him, and they planned it together, which was in its own way a more intimate thing than a great many others. The hearing in Helena before Judge Mallory lasted 2.5 days. Olive sat at the plaintiff's table with Travers and presented the case that she had spent 2 years building, the documentation of Dalton's illegal creek diversion, the surveying fraud, the downstream impact on her irrigation and her yields. The evidence from Cutter's confession was admitted as background to the pattern of conduct, though the criminal case itself was separate proceedings. Peabody the surveyor, confronted with his documented falsification of multiple surveys, had already surrendered his territorial license and provided written testimony admitting to the fraud on Dalton's property line. Judge Mallory was, as Marshall had indicated, honest. He asked precise questions and listened to the answers with the attention of a man who understood that the law, applied carefully, was capable of correcting injustice. He looked at the documentation of the creek diversion. He looked at the impact records on Olive's land. He looked at the surveying fraud and the territorial licensing records, and the pattern of conduct. He ruled in Olive's favor on every material point. The Crooked Creek water rights were apportioned equitably between the two properties, with provisions specifically preventing the kind of upstream diversion Dalton had practiced. The surveying fraud was referred to the Territorial Land Office for independent review, which would ultimately, over the next 18 months, result in the correction of 3 additional boundary disputes in the county. The ruling was, Travers told her outside the courthouse on the cold Helena Street, about as complete a victory as was possible in a territorial civil proceeding. She stood on the courthouse steps in the November cold and let it land. The win was real and solid, and she had earned every piece of it over 4 years of difficult, solitary, frequently demoralizing work. She was allowed to feel it. She felt it. Then she went inside and found the telegraph office and sent a message to Harlan, care of the boarding house, addressed to Marshal Vaughn. It said, "The judge ruled for us. All points. Come to dinner Thursday when I return. Bring your saddlebag." He was at her property when she rode up on Thursday evening, having come from Helena on the stage, and then ridden the last 9 miles from Harlan in the dusk. He was in her barn, her cattle fed and watered, a new section of fence rail on the south side replaced, she could see from the fresh wood, and a lamp burning on the hook inside the barn door. He came out when he heard the horse and held the animal while she dismounted, and she was tired from the journey and the emotional weight of the week, and she stood for a moment in the barn doorway with the warm smell of horses and hay around her. "You fixed the south rail," she said. "It was about to go," he said. "I have been meaning to get to it for 3 weeks." "I know," he said. "You have been busy." She looked at him in the lamplight. He looked back at her. There was a quality to this moment that she recognized from other moments in life when the thing you have been building toward finally arrives and you find that it is exactly what you expected and also entirely different. "Marshal," she said. "Yes. I sent that telegram. I know I received it. I told you to bring your saddlebag." "I did. That was me saying," she said carefully, "that I would like for you to stop staying at the boarding house." He was very still. "I understood that," he said. "Good," she said. He stepped toward her, and she stepped toward him, and the space between them closed, and he put his hands on either side of her face with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with how large and weather-worn those hands were, and he kissed her in the lamplight of the barn while her horse watched with philosophical equanimity. It was nothing like the first kiss in stories where the world tilts and the stars rearrange themselves. It was better than that. It was warm and honest and unhurried, the kind of kiss that knows it has time because the two people involved have already decided what comes after. She stepped back and looked at him. "I need to cook dinner," she said. "I have already started the stove," he said. She laughed. It came out of her unexpectedly, the way laughter does when it has been stored too long under practical things, and it sounded like something she had forgotten was a part of her. "You are very prepared," she said. "I have been thinking about tonight for approximately 11 days, he said. "So have I," she said, and went inside. The winter came in hard in December of 1882, the kind of Montana winter that tested everything and everyone in the territory. The temperatures dropped to 20 below on 6 separate nights, and there was a 3-day blizzard in January that buried the south fence entirely and required digging out the cattle shed by hand. But Olive's hay held. The 20 tons from Kowalski, supplemented by 2 additional loads she had purchased in November with the money she had saved from reducing her loan payment. An adjustment made possible by the water rights ruling, which had been factored into the November bank review, kept 32 head of cattle fed through February and into the first stirrings of a reluctant March. Marshall moved into the farmhouse in late November, after a conversation with Reverend Alderman in Harlan that resulted in a small and unadorned ceremony at the church on a Wednesday afternoon, attended by Heinrich Kowalski and his wife, young Travers, and 3 of Olive's neighbors from the valley. It was not the kind of wedding that anyone would mistake for a grand social event, and Olive would not have had it differently. She wore her blue wool dress and her mother's silver earrings, and carried a bunch of dried wildflowers from the bundle she kept on her windowsill. And Marshall wore his good coat, not the canvas one, a dark wool coat she had not seen him in before, and they said the words to each other in front of Reverend Alderman with the particular seriousness of people who meant them precisely. Kowalski's wife cried. Travers shook Marshall's hand with both of his. The Reverend gave them his blessing, and a copy of a psalm that Olive pressed into the back of the family Bible her mother had sent her from Ohio. They rode home together in the early winter dark, and the farmhouse was warm from the stove Marshall had lit before they left for the church, and there was a bottle of good whiskey that Kowalski had pressed into Marshall's hands as they left, and they sat at the kitchen table and drank a small amount of it and talked for a long time about things that had nothing to do with legal cases or water rights or Silas Dalton. They talked about Ohio, which she had left and occasionally missed. About the Bitterroot Valley, which Marshall described with the particular affection of someone who had loved a place before it became complicated. About what they both wanted from the land they were on, not just survival but something larger, more acreage under cultivation by spring, a second barn in the next 2 years, better cattle selectively bred over time, maybe 20 additional head if the water rights held and the south pasture recovered. "I want a proper root cellar," she said. "The one I have is adequate but not sufficient." "I know how to build one," he said. "I helped my father build one when I was 15. "Then we will build one in spring," she said. "Yes," he said. She thought about the spring, and the spring after that, and the accumulation of springs that constituted a life on a piece of land you had chosen and fought for and kept. "I am happy," she said, which surprised her even as she said it because it was so simple and she had not expected simple. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it in both of his, and she let him, and neither of them said anything for a while. Silas Dalton's criminal proceedings concluded in March of 1883. He was convicted on 3 counts of fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to commit arson, the latter requiring Cutter's testimony and the corroboration of 2 ranch hands who had been present for the relevant conversation. He was sentenced to 8 years in the territorial prison at Deer Lodge. His ranch was placed in the hands of a court-appointed administrator, while the legal questions surrounding its acquisition were sorted through, a process that was ongoing when the first aspens leafed out on Olive's Ridge, and she and Marshall began planning the spring planting. Cutter received a reduced sentence of 18 months in exchange for his testimony. Greer received 3 years. Peabody the surveyor surrendered his license and paid a fine and was not criminally charged, which Olive thought was arguably insufficient justice. But Travers pointed out that his cooperation had been essential, and the outcome of the whole case would have been harder without it. So she accepted this imperfect resolution with the pragmatism she applied to most imperfect things. The spring of 1883 brought the root cellar, which took 3 weeks and was more work than Marshall had initially estimated, and which turned out to be significantly better than the old one, deep enough to keep root vegetables from January through April, and cool enough in summer to store dairy products. It also brought 12 new calves from the herd, 10 of which survived and thrived, and an additional 15 acres of ground broken and planted with the combination of grain and hay that Olive had worked out was the most productive use of her south slope. Marshall had declined the Elkins job. Elkins had been disappointed, and then understanding when Marshall explained that he had reason to remain where he was, and Elkins had hired instead a man from Great Falls who by all accounts was doing well. Marshall turned his skills to the Lawson property with the same focused attention he gave everything, and he turned out to be not only hardworking but genuinely creative. It was his idea to rotate the east pasture in the summer and rest it in winter, which recovered the grass significantly and allowed her to carry more cattle the following year. And his idea to plant a windbreak of young cottonwoods along the north fence line, which would take years to reach full height, but was the kind of investment that said something about intention. He also, in quiet moments that she did not fully register until much later built things. Small things that he left without comment, a proper coat hook by the door to replace the nail she had been using, a window box on the south side of the house that she planted with herbs in May, a shelf in the barn for the tools she was always setting on the ground because there was nowhere to put them. He did not announce these improvements or ask for acknowledgement of them. She found them and they became part of the landscape of the farm, and she understood that this was how he expressed something that he could also express in words but preferred to show in wood and nails, and the quiet satisfaction of a thing made right. She was, it turned out, capable of happiness. She had not been certain of this before. She had been capable of determination and resilience and a kind of fierce, productive stubbornness, but happiness was a different order of thing, and she had thought perhaps she had missed the window for it. She had not missed the window. She had simply been waiting without knowing she was waiting for the conditions to be right. By the summer of 1883, the conditions were very right. She discovered in late June that she was going to have a child. She had suspected it for 3 weeks before she was certain, and she was certain on a Tuesday morning when the evidence was conclusive, and she sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and looked at the light coming through the window and felt the particular large quietness of an enormous thing arriving. Marshall was in the south field mending the irrigation channel when she went to tell him. She walked out in the late morning heat with her sleeves rolled up and her hat on and the grass yellow around her boots, and he looked up when he heard her coming and immediately set down the shovel, because there was something in how she was walking that told him this was important. She stopped in front of him. He waited. "We are going to have a child," she said. He was very still for a moment. Then he put one hand against her face, the same gesture as the first night in the barn, the careful, enormous gentleness of it, and he said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. He exhaled slowly, and she saw it move through him, not shock exactly, but the full arrival of something he had hoped for without quite letting himself fully hope. He put his arms around her and she leaned into him, and they stood in the south field in the July heat with the creek running cold 30 yards to the east and the sound of the cattle in the north pasture and the ridge of ponderosa pine against the summer sky. "A son," he said against her hair, and then caught himself. "Or a daughter, whatever comes." "Whatever comes," she agreed. Henry James Vaughn was born in February of 1884, which was, the midwife from Harlan remarked, one of the most inconvenient possible times to be born in Montana, given the weather. He was born healthy and loud, and with an expression of profound indignation that Olive recognized as the natural attitude of anyone who had just experienced what he had just experienced. She held him in the dim, cold bedroom while the February storm moved outside the window, and thought that she had not, until this exact moment, understood how much room there was in a person's heart. Marshall was permitted into the room after approximately 40 minutes of waiting in the kitchen, which he filled by making coffee, and then not drinking it and making the bed in the spare room, and then standing at the window. When the midwife called him in, he came to the bedside and looked at Olive and at the small, furious, perfect person she was holding, and he sat down on the edge of the bed, and she watched him fall in love with his son in real time, which was one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. "Henry," he said softly. "Henry," she confirmed. Henry opened one eye, assessed his father with the skepticism of a very young but already opinionated person, and then closed it again. "He will keep," Marshall said. "He will keep," Olive agreed. "The midwife, Mrs. Hartley, pronounced everyone healthy and left at dusk with her payment, and a jar of Olive's preserved plum jam, which she had been given as a supplemental token of gratitude. Olive and Marshall and Henry spent their first night as a family of 3 in the warm farmhouse, while the blizzard did what blizzards do, and the stove worked faithfully through the night, and the cattle were safe in the barn. They had expanded the previous fall in preparation for exactly this kind of winter. Kowalski came by the following week with his wife, and brought a carved wooden cradle that his own daughters had slept in, which had been passed among the neighboring families for 12 years, and had held 11 babies, and was apparently considered something of a good luck object in the Judith Basin. Travers came by and was visibly moved by the baby in the way that young lawyers without children of their own sometimes are, with an excess of solemnity that Henry addressed by yawning. Life settled into its new shape. It was fuller than before and more complicated, and there were exhausting weeks when Henry declined to sleep for more than 2 hours at a stretch, and everything was accomplished in a fog of genuine tiredness. But it was a fullness that she had not known to want specifically, and now could not imagine without. Marshall, she discovered, was the kind of father that she might have predicted from the man she had watched work, patient, attentive, fundamentally incapable of walking past a need without addressing it. He woke for the nighttime, feeding more often than she realized he was doing, letting her sleep, because he had noted that she woke more slowly and that the rest was useful for her in the weeks immediately after the birth. He did not announce this. She figured it out. When she told him she knew, he shrugged in the particular understated way of his that meant he had done it deliberately and saw no need for credit. The legal aftermath of the Dalton case continued to play out through 1883 and 1884, most of it without requiring Olive's direct attention. The Territorial Land Office review of the fraudulent surveys resulted in boundary corrections for 2 neighboring properties, one of which was resolved easily, and one of which generated a separate legal dispute between the affected parties. The Crooked Creek Ranch was ultimately purchased by a consortium of smaller ranchers in 1884 through a court-supervised auction, which represented, in Trevors's analysis, a genuine redistribution of consolidated land that had broader positive implications for the county. The water rights remained as Judge Mallory had decreed them. The creek ran through its proper course. The south irrigation channel filled each spring, and the south pasture stayed green through August, and the yields came in strong in the first good year and better in the second. She filed the final homestead proof in the spring of 1884, after 5 years of continuous improvement in residence. The land officer in Helena who reviewed the file noted that it was one of the most thorough and well-documented homestead proofs he had processed in 6 years, which Olive thought was pleasant but expected. She had not come 4 years and 2,000 miles to do anything imprecisely. The deed to 160 acres of Judith Basin, Montana territory, free and clear, arrived at the Harlan Post Office on a Wednesday in May. Marshall picked it up on his way back from town with a load of supplies and set it on the kitchen table without ceremony, and she opened it and read it and then set it down and covered it with both hands as though it might try to leave. "It is real," she said. "It is very real," he said. She thought about the train platform in Columbus in 1878, the clerk who had looked at her as though she had announced an intention to swim to the moon, the trunk and the seeds and the thing she had not wanted to call hope. The frost on the fence posts that first winter and the spring that followed and every difficult, magnificent, impossible year since. "My mother would have been very pleased," she said. "Tell me about her," he said, and sat down at the table across from her, and she did. Henry grew. He was a dark-haired, serious, curious child who had his father's tendency to watch things carefully before acting, and his mother's absolute refusal to accept an unsatisfactory answer to a question. He could walk by the time the aspens turned gold in his first autumn, and by the following spring, he was conducting his own investigations of the lower pasture with the focused intensity of a very small scientist. He had opinions about the cattle's specific preferences among the herd that he expressed through pointing and sounds that gradually became words, and he was. The Kowalski daughters agreed on their visits, the most charming baby in the county, which Olive took as a pleasant assessment from a partial audience. The summer of 1884 brought a second pregnancy, which announced itself in July and progressed smoothly through the fall and into the winter. By that December, Olive was moving more carefully around the farm, and Marshall had, without discussion, adjusted every task between them in the small practical ways that people adjust when something important is growing and must be protected. Their daughter arrived in March of 1885, on a day that was, by Montana standards, practically gentle, a gray morning with light snow falling and no wind, the kind of day that felt like a pause rather than a threat. She came more easily than Henry had, and with considerably less of her brother's opening indignation, arriving with an expression that was more thoughtful than outraged, as though she had been considering the situation carefully and had decided to proceed. They named her Clara Rose Vaughn, for Olive's mother and for the wild roses that grew on the south bank of the creek and bloomed every June in a color that had no name she could locate in any book, but that she thought of simply as home. Henry, presented with his sister at the age of just over a year, examined her with the serious attention he brought to all new things, and then patted her hand once with his small, careful palm, which Marshall witnessed and did not comment on because some things do not need commentary. The farm in the summer of 1885 was a different thing from the farm Olive had stood on in 1878. The aspens she had planted along the creek were young trees now, green and silver in the summer light. The root cellar was everything it should have been. The barn was expanded, the cattle herd grown to 44 head, the south pasture recovered and lush, the irrigation running clear and properly apportioned. The house had a second room that Marshall had built off the back in the spring, not grand, but solid, with proper windows and pine floors that stayed warm because he had laid the subfloor with the careful attention he brought to everything. In the evenings, when the children were settled and the work was done and the summer dark came down slow over the ridge, they sat on the porch she had built in her second year, one of the first things she had built, a modest porch with 2 chairs, because she had believed even then that she would stay and that staying required a place to sit and watch the end of the day. They sat there and talked and were quiet and looked at the land. "Do you ever think about Wyoming?" she asked one evening. "Sometimes," he said. "In the way you think about a place you have left. Do you miss it?" He considered. "I miss who I thought I was going to be there," he said, "not the place itself." She understood this. "I miss Ohio in the way you miss something that existed before you knew it was going to end," she said. "Not the Ohio I left, the Ohio that was my mother's kitchen in October." He reached for her hand and she gave it to him, and they sat with the September dark coming down and the children sleeping inside and the cattle quiet in the north pasture and the creek running its proper course to the east. "I did not expect any of this," she said. "Neither did I," he said. "Is it what you wanted?" He turned to look at her in the last light. His face was brown from the summer, and he had grown a beard in July that she had told him she did not mind and had privately decided she preferred. He was 33 years old, and the years on him were the kind that improved rather than diminished, the way good weather improves a landscape. "It is everything I wanted," he said, "including the parts I did not know to want." She tightened her hand in his. The first star appeared above the pine ridge to the north. "In the spring," she said, "I want to plant the north corner. The rocky section you have been saying is not worth breaking. I think it is worth it if we turn it properly and add to it over 2 years." "I think you are probably right," he said. "I usually am," she said. "I know," he said, and she heard the quiet smile in it, the warmth, the full knowledge of her that it implied. The north corner was planted the following spring and turned out by the second year to be some of the best ground on the property for winter wheat, which Olive added to her notes with the particular satisfaction of being right about something that other people had been doubtful about. Henry started school in Harlan in the fall of 1887, walking the road with Marshall 3 days a week and riding the horse the other 2. He could read already. Olive had taught him from her own books, the small library she had brought from Ohio and supplemented with careful purchases over the years. And the school teacher, Miss Brennan, told them at their first meeting that Henry was the most prepared student she had enrolled in the fall term. Olive thanked her without expressing the opinion that she had expected nothing less. Clara, who followed her brother everywhere with a persistence that Henry found simultaneously flattering and inconvenient, was learning to talk with the enthusiasm of someone making up for lost time, and had opinions on most subjects and the vocabulary to express them. She had Olive's green eyes and Marshall's steady way of looking at a situation, and the particular combination produced a child who was, even at 2 years old, someone you wanted to have on your side. The fall of 1887 brought a third pregnancy. Olive was 32 years old, and the third came with the same straightforward reliability as the land and the seasons and the man beside her in the bed at night. She was not surprised. She was grateful. Their second son, William Heinrich Vaughan, the second name for Kowalski, who had been quietly and instrumentally present for many of the most important moments of their life on this land, arrived in April of 1888, in the best possible way, without complication, on a morning when the willows along the creek were just beginning to show their first green. He was a round, cheerful, immediately social baby who greeted the world with a broad, toothless goodwill that was either entirely his own or a combination of both his parents' better qualities distilled into something simple and pleasant. Heinrich Kowalski, informed of the honor, showed up at the door 4 days later with his wife and a ham, and was visibly moved in the particular way of large, practical men who encounter large, practical gestures made toward them. He shook Marshall's hand for a long time and kissed Olive's cheek, and held William with the practiced ease of a man who had held many babies and understood their basic requirements. "Good boy," he said, looking at William. "He is," Marshall agreed. "And the other too." "Henry reads everything he can find and Clara argues every point he makes," Olive said. "They are a useful check on each other." Kowalski laughed, a large sound, and it filled the warm kitchen of the farmhouse on the hill above Crooked Creek. And outside the willows were green and the creek ran clear, and the cattle were in the south pasture in the April sun, and the pine ridge made its long good shadow across the north fence line. Travers came to dinner that month with his new wife, a quiet and very intelligent woman named Ruth who had come from Minnesota to teach school and stayed to marry a lawyer, which she said was not so different from what she had planned. Travers had grown in his practice over the years. He had 3 other lawyers in his firm now, and a reputation in the territory for handling complex land cases with particular skill, which could be attributed at least in part to the education he had received in the Lawson water rights case in 1882 and 1883. He said so, at dinner, raising his glass. "To the Lawson case," he said, "which taught me more about land law, evidence gathering, and the practical meaning of perseverance than 3 years of reading could have managed." Olive looked at him across the dinner table, in the lamplight of the house she had built her life in, with her husband beside her and her children sleeping in the rooms beyond and her land secured, and her creek running true and her haystack a new one, built properly in the previous August, stacked tight against the weather standing solid at the east end of the property. "To the Lawson case," she said. Marshall raised his glass. His eyes found hers over the rim of it, and what was in them was the whole of it: the dark road at 4 in the morning, the calves in the frost, the coffee at the kitchen table, the note spread on the wooden surface, the barn door, the lamp, the first kiss and all the ones after, the land deed beneath her hands, the children, the seasons, the accumulated weight of a life built alongside someone who had not left, who had never, not once, left. She raised her glass to his across the table, and he held her gaze, and in that look was everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. The winters that would be hard, and the springs that would be green, and the mornings in the south field and the evenings on the porch, and the children growing, and the land turning, and the creek running on its proper course between 2 pieces of ground that belonged to people who had earned them. It was not the life she had planned. It was something considerably better. Outside, the April night lay quiet over the Judith Basin. The stars were very clear above the ridge of ponderosa pine, the way they are clear in Montana when the air is dry and cold and honest, and the creek moved in the dark past willows that were new green at their tips. And in the house on the hill, the lamp burned warm and the voices inside were good ones, full of the particular ease of people who have come through difficult things together and arrived, against various odds, at exactly where they should be. This was the thing that Olive Lawson, who was now Olive Vaughn, though she kept Lawson on the property deed because she had earned it separately, and it meant something to her separately, and Marshall had said without hesitation that this was right, had learned over the years that followed the night of the fire. That survival and happiness were not the same register, but they were not opposed either. That the work of surviving, done alongside someone who stayed, could become the foundation for something that deserved a richer name. She had stood at the edge of her property in the smoke and the frost with everything burning, and she had thought about Silas Dalton's dark satisfaction 4 miles to the east, and she had been furious and afraid and entirely alone. And then hoofbeats on the road, and a man on a horse who dismounted without being asked and held the lantern while she assessed the damage and said, without flinching, that the fire had been set, and who had fed and watered his own horse before coming in for coffee and who had asked before using her oats. Who had stayed? The fiddle player in Harlan had been slightly out of tune on the night she and Marshall had stood on the main street, and she had told him she did not do well with comfortable things. The fiddle player had eventually gotten better. She had heard practice through 2 winters, and by the 3rd year was the best musician in the county, playing for dances and celebrations with a skill that made people forget the years of rough notes. Things got better with practice and time and the particular stubbornness that refuses to stop trying. She knew this. She had always known this, in the specific way that farmers know it, not from philosophy but from evidence, from the ground itself, which gives back more than you put in if you treat it honestly and do not give up on it. She set her glass down on the dinner table and looked at the lamplight on the faces of the people she had made a life with and from, and she was, as she had told Marshall the previous autumn on the porch, happy. Simply and specifically happy, in the way that people are happy when the thing they have built is solid and true and theirs. Outside, the creek ran on. The stars were clear above the ridge. The night was quiet over the Judith Basin, and it would be quiet for a long time yet, and in the morning she would rise before 6 and so would he, and they would begin another day on the land that she had fought for and won, and that now held everything worth keeping. She would not have changed a single difficult thing. She would not have changed any of it at all.